And Senan, you'll remind them that it's being recorded as well.
Yep, I sure will.
Okay.
Live now.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest cybersecurity webinar from Nostra. I'm Senan Finucane, Principal Solutions Architect here at Nostra. Great to have you with us again today, and thanks as always for joining our growing cybersecurity awareness community. Before we get started, a quick reminder. If you didn't catch any of our earlier webinars in this security series, you can find them all on our Nostra YouTube channel. We'll send out links in a follow-up email after today's session. So, over the past few sessions, we've been focusing on compliance, things like NIS2, directive, and frameworks such as NIST and DORA. Last time we talked about cyber risk management. It's a big part of those frameworks and really important when it comes to overall cybersecurity. Today, we're taking things in a slightly different direction and focusing on recommended practices in supplier management. Only a few weeks ago, M&S were on the wrong end of a major cyber attack, and it's suspected that the attackers gained access to their systems via a third-party service provider. So it really can happen to any business, big and small alike. So we really do need to take the right steps to be best protected. As always, we really encourage you to get involved. These webinars are much better when they're interactive. So if you have any questions along the way, just pop them into the chat and we'll do our best to cover them. We're also recording today's session and we'll send out both the recording and the slides afterwards. The weather's a bit gloomy out there, so hopefully Jason's dulcet tones can help brighten up your morning. So now I'll hand you over to our compliance guy, Jason Burns, who's going to lead us through today's webinar. Thanks, folks.
Oh, thank you very much, Senan. Thank you. And as you can see on the screen there, we also have Reg Stollard, also from our compliance department, with us today. So please feel free, as Senan says, to make it as interactive as we can. And if there's any questions or observations through it, delighted to get them. Now, going back to basics with ourselves, we say security is a journey, and some of you will have seen this slide already. And we have our pillars as to how we do what we do. Now, with the advent of many of the compliance regulations that have come in the past, we add in other pillars to that. And one of the ones is today supplier management. Now, as we look to manage that, our preference is to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. So you'll see that being mentioned as we go through as well. The other elements that you could use would be the CIS controls, ISO, or Cyber Essentials. We're looking today really at risk management again, which we touched briefly on from a supplier point of view in the last webinar. And ISO and NIST would handle that very well. So, as Senan pointed out, M&S in the UK had their issue recently, and perhaps one of the big ticket ones a number of years back, where both NASA, the Federal Aviation Authority, and if memory serves me right, Microsoft were affected by a third-party vulnerability in an application that was running on all of those companies. Similarly, last year we had the issue where a great deal of the flight control or flight management for the airlines was affected by an update done by one of their third parties. In other words, not their own machines. An update was done, and all of a sudden nobody could get on their planes because the booking systems were all down. So what are we saying here? Supply chains attacks are increasingly common and damaging, and it doesn't have to be an attack. In that case, it was a well-meaning update. But the problem can still occur. And you can see then as well that 60% of data breaches originate from third-party vendors. A bit like the statistic that the number one source of a breach for any company is the person at the desk. You can see behind those breaches that are coming in, come in through third-party vendors. Who amongst us hasn't received an email from some poor misfortunate that their account was compromised or at least was impersonated, and it can look like it's coming from them. So we all need to be careful about that. So what's the reality around supplier management? Well, what we really want to do is make sure we're doing best practices, both in cybersecurity around them and the management of the risk. So we need to look at what do we do and who do we do it with. We need to define our expectations of them. We need to understand the risk associated with them. We need to make sure we monitor the risk and then have an exit strategy in the case that something goes substantially wrong with them. So as we work through those requirements, we have the regulatory requirements like NIS2 coming in and DORA. We have to assess and monitor the cybersecurity posture of suppliers as a result of those. We have to look at putting various clauses in contracts in order to manage that. We have to look at requiring audits and incident reporting from suppliers. I remember when I started over 30 years ago, one of the first things I did was participate in a customer audit for an RF company producing chips for Nokia. So not specifically related to cybersecurity at the time, but the point now remains valid for everyone in the IT industry. We can be audited by either a supervisory authority or our customer if the contract requires it. We have to ensure that incident response readiness is appropriate and that we have appropriate business continuity in place. And why do we do all of that? Well, because we might get hit by regulatory penalties. We could also get contractual penalties just because we're small. Perhaps the NIS2 or the DORA requirement doesn't actually apply to us. However, there may be penalties in contracts we sign with our customers where we have to look at it, or our clients expect. We could suffer disruption of our operations, and we can suffer reputational damage. For example, Marks and Spencer's, the most recent one. So relative to the regulations, what are some of the considerations from them to suppliers? Now, this is not exhaustive, but here's a couple of items. Under NIS2, we need to assess and monitor the cybersecurity posture of suppliers. In other words, are they reaching the levels that we expect? We need to include certain cybersecurity clauses in contracts in order to make sure there's a legal requirement around it. And we look for the ability to audit and get appropriate incident reporting from suppliers. As well as that, for DORA, we have to make sure we implement a detailed third-party risk management system. The focus is largely on the ICT providers, and you have to submit a register of information to your supervisory authority. So this register acts as a centralized database, ensuring there's transparency about what's going on, there's effective risk management, and there's oversight of it because it needs to be maintained and reported to the national authorities. So under GDPR, we all have the register of processing activities, but that's an internal record which may be looked for and we must maintain. Whereas DORA takes it another level in, and you have to actually supply it to the regulatory authority. We need to keep doing our risk assessments, and we need to ensure our incident response is ready and our business continuity is good. So DORA is all around digital operations resilience. So if something is important, can we keep it running? Or if it does go down, can we get it back up as quickly as possible? Now, what would be key elements for supplier management? So going back to the title of today, what are best practices? Well, we need to classify our vendors by risk level. If there's somebody that doesn't have a high risk, why would we spend a lot of time trying to ensure certain items of them? Let's prioritize who we're working with. Conduct pre-onboarding assessments. Now, when regulations come in, we're always already dealing with people, so we have to retrospectively do that. But for anyone coming in new, we need to take a fresh look as we go in, and we need to learn from previous experiences, and we need to put in the requirements and carry on from that point. We need to do our continuous monitoring. We need to make sure we include our contractual obligations, and then ideally we need to use tools to make sure that our risk scoring and our compliance tracking is managed appropriately. Now, I'll go through some of those in more detail now. So you may recognize this from the previous presentation. This gives us our risk levels and whether we're happy with the risk level, or it's something we need to keep an eye on, or something we need to deal with very quickly. So this goes back to the point about managing a tool set in order to ensure that we maintain our posture correctly. So looking to see, does a risk go up or down? Have we actually taken care of the risk? We need to put appropriate management around that. So what do? We categorize the suppliers based on their impact on our operations or their impact on our data. So for example, then if we have an exposure there, in the data side, it could be a relatively small amount of data, but it could be super sensitive. So we need to be very careful about that. On the other hand, it could be something that maybe stops product leaving the operation. So two sides to the coin, practical and data. Common categories, critical, high, low. You can come up with any tier level. Some are 5 levels, some are 3 levels. It depends what works for yourselves. We'll come back to proportionality and appropriateness later. The reality is, what is it that works for your business? Once we've done those risks, it helps us to prioritize the oversight on it, and also the resource allocation to it. If something is red, let's associate resources to it and let's prioritize it. If something is yellow, we'll deal with the reds first. When DORA was coming out, one of the items that was published was an advisory that if you haven't really done much on DORA, well, one of the first things we want you to do is to do a risk assessment and prioritize those risks and to develop your asset list and your supplier list so that you know what it is. So if you consider that that's what the supervisory authorities consider as important, really good place to start. Look at your risks. Now, some of you will have seen this from the previous webinar, because at the time I said there is overlap. So we need to assess our third-party supply chain risk. So what are we going to look? We're going to look for the dependencies. So this is output from our business impact assessment. And we're going to recognize what dependencies there are on third-party for critical or important or essential processes or output from your business, and if there's a risk associated with it. Once we've identified whether the risks are there, we're going to look at the disruptions and what they might look like, and then prepare our response to those disruptions. And once we've identified those, we then look to see what can we do to mitigate any of those risks, disruptions, interruptions to potential disruptions to our service. What is the impact that it will have on our business? And so how can we actually avoid that risk happening in the future? Or if it does happen, how quickly can we recover from it? So we assign what is our risk appetite to it, or our risk tolerances to it, and decide, yes, here we go, we're going to assign our resources to that this year, and we're going to make sure we drop that risk down low, and that way we have a less of an exposure in the event that it happens. And ultimately, that will then ensure stability and continuity of our business as we go forward. It gives confidence to our customers, our clients, and our employees, because we need to keep our operations running. So pre-onboarding assessments, we need to evaluate what our supplier's cybersecurity posture is currently. We need to look and see, is that appropriate for what we need? Do we need to ask them to raise their game? Do we need to give them time to do that? Are we prepared to tolerate that risk and bring it on? Do they have standards in place already, like the ISO 27001 or SOC 2, both frameworks or certifications that could be useful in order to give you a datum as to what that company's cybersecurity posture actually looks like? We also need to look in terms of financial stability and legal standing, and I would also say availability. So at a simple level, if you have a supplier that is a 1 or 2 person organization that you rely on really for a really critical process, you have to ask yourself the question, what would happen if there was an issue there? What is the state of their business? Is there a legal challenge to them in some shape or form? I have seen companies where they have an exposure to something like that, where they actually buy that company so that they own the intellectual property and the expertise that's in that business. Ultimately, it boils down to due diligence. You need to do your due diligence on when you're onboarding, and you need to come up with your checklists associated with it, decide what is important for the business, and make sure that we address it as we bring it on. If there's a risk there, what's the time frame that we're willing that that risk can be addressed? With a number of the regulations, you need to include contractual obligations. If we're not familiar of it with GDPR, we have standard clauses that need to be in on data transfer. With NIST too, there are elements around cybersecurity. With DORA, there are various elements around incident response, auditing, and so on. We'll come to that a little bit later. We need to make sure they're in there. We need to define the audit rights and the reporting timelines under both DORA and the NIS2. You have to report incidents within a certain period of time. Everyone needs to be aware of that. We have it under GDPR. It's in here under these. Unfortunately, they don't line up, so they're not all the same. They're very similar, though. So if you err on the side of caution, you'll make sure that you actually get there. We need to make sure our supply chain will adhere to that. And we need to ensure legal enforceability of the security expectations. There is no point in us having a conversation around the table and the supplier says, yes, of course, we'll do that. We need to have that in place from a legal standpoint. Final piece there, we must ensure that legal advice is taken around this. There are two elements here. One element is, are we adhering to the regulation ourselves? Have we put in place the appropriate items in the contracts themselves? And also, are the elements that we have in the contract fit for purpose? Are they enforceable? Now, once we've done our initial assessment, we've decided that that supplier is good. We have our baseline for that supplier. We need to then regularly assess the supplier risk and performance. Are they in terms of performance? When we go in and check on their audit or their reports, whatever we've put in place, are they actually matching it? Simple level. Are they addressing vulnerabilities in the time frame expected? I have had customers that their requirement from their own customer is that within 4 hours, every critical vulnerability needs to be applied. It's a touch onerous, but they wanted the contract and we had to put in place the service that would allow them to do that. Other customers, maybe not quite so onerous. It could be something as simple as, is the system in place such that we can have our product out of the warehouse within 8 hours if there's a problem? Ultimately, we need to check, can that supplier meet that 8-hour time frame? Otherwise, why did we put it into the document? We need to monitor for changes in the security posture or the compliance status. Perhaps they have been acquired. Perhaps there was a downturn in business. Is there an issue that may result in their security posture dropping? Perhaps the budget is no longer there. Perhaps resources have left the building. We need to make sure that we keep that up to date. We need to be aware of it and we need to address it if it becomes an issue. Similarly, like ourselves, we hold our ISO 27001 certification. That's something that's elective. Just because we have it today doesn't necessarily mean we'll have it in 12 months. So if you're relying on a supplier having that certification, you must get a copy of it, note when its date is due to expire, note any surveillance audits that may be mentioned on it and when they might happen. And as part of your auditing process, look perhaps to get that feedback from that audit, because one of the elements here is, do you get third-party audits done? And a third-party assessment by a certifying authority, also very useful. Now, we look at our risk scoring and our compliance tracking. So as part of our supplier management, we look to implement tools that will facilitate the management of it. So what does that actually look like? We want to track the compliance with the regulatory and contractual obligations. And when we enable a compliance calendar and resources appropriately for proactive risk management. What does that really mean? Well, a compliance calendar will give you elements throughout the year that you look for a measurement or a value or a response, a KPI, something similar that says, yes, our supplier is actually meeting those or is exceeding them. Similarly, as we go through that compliance calendar, that tool will allow us to identify if there's an issue with the risk levels raising, and so we can manage them. And then you live the framework. So what do I mean by that? So we have to implement an appropriate risk management. National Cybersecurity Centre says the NIST 2 cybersecurity framework is a great method of doing this. There's no point in putting it in once and leaving it there. We have to actually do it on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, twice yearly, annually. When you put it in place, it will give you those indicators of what you should be looking at and when. The moment you put in something, it's become out of date potentially within 3 months, perhaps, in the modern world. So you need to check each month, are we keeping it up to date? Is there something new out there? Has there been a change? For example, the Orion vulnerability that hit NASA, that was perfectly fine 2 months previously. When it hit, now not fine, we need to find a different method of doing what we do. The framework will challenge you to do continuous improvement, continuous assessment, and continuous monitoring. So a really useful tool to get you to a level and to maintain that level. So here's the framework that we've seen before. We can see our 6 areas: govern, across all of them, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And on the left-hand side there, we can see the individual elements. So we can see a risk management strategy. We can see cybersecurity chain risk management. We can see roles and responsibilities, who has been assigned to it, what are the resources, all the elements there to ensure that we meet our regulatory requirements, all in there to help us. So what's its applicability to supplier management? Those elements there align with the regulatory requirements for third-party risk management. It supports our due diligence, our contractual obligations, and our audit readiness. And it helps build a confidence with stakeholders. So when we look to partner with a tool set or a service for our customers, we look at what it is that they do. And if we can see that they're matching or exceeding frameworks or certifications, it gives us confidence. If we can get the updates from those, it similarly gives us the confidence that this is a good organization, it's a professional organization, they'll be here next week. This will be good for our customers. For anyone on the call, for your own businesses, you need to look for the same thing, that if somebody is using one of those frameworks, and in this case, NIST 2, then you can say with some certainty, well, they have a good framework there. Let's see the output from it. Now, some specific items for DORA. Now, I haven't pulled out everything because we could spend a day going through contractual obligations around DORA. So what do we need to look for in a contract? What is the description of the ICT service that we're receiving? We need to look for what is the location of where that IT service is coming from and where the data is. There'll be provisions around the protection of data, including personal data. So this is this area where you have GDPR, the NIS2, and DORA all coming together, and there are elements within all of them that cover various areas. We need to look for cooperation with the financial entities competent authority. We need to make sure we have an appropriate exit process in place. We need to look at what are the service levels we're going to receive. We're going to look for incident support when it happens. What's the availability of the supplier? What resources will they put in place? What is their intention around that? And what do we require them to do? We're going to look where it's appropriate that they participate in our security awareness program and our digital operation resilience testing and training. So, for example, when we look at our disaster recovery plan, we want to make sure that if we're going to need our third party involved, that they will be available. So does that have to be in the contract in some shape or form, or updated within the contract to ensure that? Once again, I'm sure our own legal people wouldn't thank me if I didn't mention this. Legal advice should be taken on all the contractual obligations. This is not something that, unless you come from a legal obligation, that I would suggest is something we take from the articles, because there may be other elements that you and I aren't aware of, whereas the legal expertise will make sure we stay between the ditches. Now, looking at some practical elements around this, where does the NIST2 framework become mapped to both DORA and the NIS2 directive? So we can see here that in the governance category, we have supply chain risk management, and under DORA, that matches with our ICT third-party risk management and oversight. So governance, oversight. Similarly, under NIST2, the supply chain risk. The next category, we have identify and supply chain risk management. So looking at that, that would be match our register of information. And under NIST2, our risk management measures. Next one, under governance, roles and responsibilities. So contractual provisions, and governance and accountability. Who is responsible? Who has responsibility for it? Who are the people that are going to be doing this for us? Asset management, identification of the ICT provider. So as we said in the last webinar, there is a crossover between assets and third-party suppliers, because some of our assets are software, some of our assets is data, and third parties may provide that software as a service or similar. So we need to make sure we identify them, and we need to make sure that we have them in our register information, and they carry on then into our disaster recovery and business continuity plan. Final element then, which is fundamental to all of this, is our risk assessment. We take a risk-based approach to our third parties, and we have continuous risk assessment around them. Now, so we've looked at our framework. We have identified the elements relative to supplier management. So we look to develop a supplier management around the framework. So lifecycle management. So our supplier management involves overseeing suppliers from onboarding, ongoing appraisal, offboarding, ensuring the risk levels throughout the life cycle are known. We look to implement policies and procedures to ensure that we adhere to our management program. So it will have well-defined policies, procedures that will allow us to guide our supplier decisions and our actions around them. Part of that management program, we will have roles and responsibilities defined for effective supplier management, facilitating accountability and clear communication. Now, under many of these frameworks or programs, they can fall down if resources aren't assigned to the project appropriately. So if we're implementing a framework in an organization and we're already very busy, we have to ask ourselves, what are the resources we're going to apply? So when we look at roles and responsibilities, does Jason really have the time to do that? Can Senan provide those reports monthly? Do we have the ability to do that? If not, do we need to look at either onboarding additional resources or potentially getting outsourced resources in order to do that, or to invest in tools that will allow us to manage them more efficiently? All part of the supplier management program. Part of the supplier management program, then, we prioritize our supplier partnerships based on the impact. So we look to see what are the critical suppliers that we have, and that we engage with them as part of this program, both on the initial engagement and during emergencies, and that the response teams are aware of this. This will help guide our recovery efforts. So we want to ensure that the essential operations can resume swiftly after the disruption. So depending on where you operate in the economy, will you come in under no regulations? Will you come in under the NIS2 as an operator of an essential or an important service, or will you come in under DORA as a financial entity? And within those entities, how can we recover quickly? and make sure that our policies and our management program facilitates that. And then, as we discussed, the resource allocation. It's important on a day-to-day basis. It's really important when we have an emergency or an incident. We need to be aware of who is going to be called. They need to be aware of their roles and responsibilities in the environment, and we need to also ensure that they've been trained around this. There is nothing worse than putting in place a system, and as I said earlier, we need to live the framework, and then we've trained 2 or 3 people, and maybe one of those people leaves the company, maybe another person goes to a different area, and the knowledge is lost. So we need to maintain that so that we have better management of our resources in the company in order to ensure that the incident will be responded to. Now, as we continue on with the management program, we need to make sure that we get regular reviews or updates from our risk assessed suppliers to make sure that it remains accurate and reflects the current risks that are in there. We need to maintain documentation around this. There is very little point in making sure we've done something well today if we don't have the record of it in order to understand what it was, in order to learn from it as we move forward. When we can then look back at the end of the month and we can say, right, this is what we were supposed to do. Did we do it? Yes, I have the records that we did it. No, I have no record that we did it. And Senan has gone on holidays. So should we do it again? So now we've used our resources twice, perhaps, or perhaps we're not maintaining the documentation and we don't realize that we haven't done something and now we have an exposure. So this is really live the system. Getting our stakeholder engagement in place. We ensure that our stakeholders are engaged in the supplier management so that we have ownership and responsibility. Stakeholders are critical in any organization. We all know of projects where it was a great idea, but unfortunately the critical person didn't buy into it, so it didn't happen. So when we're putting in place these systems, we need to come in at a fundamental level and ensure that there's appropriate buy-in from all the stakeholders to make sure that we can live this system correctly. Now, we've put in place our system. So we have our continuous monitoring and improvement. So as well as monitoring our actual suppliers, we need to monitor the system itself. We need to review and see, is the system itself fit for purpose? So when we look at our organization, we look to see, are there any changes or updated risks within our own organization? Is there something we need to change relative to our suppliers? Has the business strategy gone in a different direction? And how will that reflect on our supplier management? So we do our regular reviews of the system, and we make sure that they remain effective and that they're responsive to changes. And we also ensure that we address emerging risks. So the emerging risk from the M&S vulnerability recently was the fact that it was related to IT support. So do we need to put in controls around how do we validate that IT support is who they say they are? In a similar vein, from an IT support point of view, how do we ensure that somebody ringing in is actually the customer, and we're not changing a password that we shouldn't, or we're not allowing access to somebody that we shouldn't. So we need to make any necessary adjustments in response to any emerging risk to make sure that our practices remain valid. And perhaps we need to take a step back and look to the wider world, conduct contacts with peer groups or similar, because we can get very insular in our own organization. We can become complacent around it. So elements of both DORA and the NIS2 directive is to maintain peer group contacts. And we all know, sitting around having a coffee with someone, we often get a nugget of information which makes our business process much, much better. So we look at those fabulous words which are in a lot of the regulations. Is what you're doing proportionate, or is what you're doing appropriate? So if we apply that now to supplier due diligence, we look at what is the value of what we have, what are we protecting, and we say, right, when we're looking at financial stability of a company, what do their results look like? What do they have any outstanding legal matters? So, for example, if we look at Office 365, well, that comes courtesy of Microsoft. Our due diligence there might be very low because Microsoft, we expect, are going to be a blue chip company carrying on. There has been no noise in the financial press about Microsoft being in trouble. And we can go onto their trust center and we can download information about them. On the other hand, if someone comes knocking on our door and they say, I have this fabulous product, and you look at them up on LinkedIn, for example, and you see the company has only existed 2 years, and then you run up a financial health check on them and you see, well, actually they didn't do so well last year and nothing for this year, you might decide that that critical element of our business, maybe that's not appropriate to give to them just yet. Under regulatory compliance, is what we're doing proportionate or appropriate? So under GDPR, do we have a large amount of sensitive data, or is most of what we're doing business to business purchase orders? In which case, when we look at our suppliers, do we need to, would we consider them critical, high or low? Chances are they're critical from the point of view of operation. We need to make sure we get our product out the door. However, are they critical in respect of the actual data itself? Perhaps not. So if we lose the data and we can restore from a backup, that's not a problem. And also, if we lose the purchase orders and so on, there may be some commercially sensitive information in there, but there may not be any personally sensitive data in there. And then we look for our SLAs. So if our own contracts with our own suppliers say we must be back up within 4 hours, well, we need to make sure that our ICT services also have that in there, that they can assist us in that. And if they can't assist us in that, how do we go about getting additional services in there? Similarly, if we have to respond to an incident in certain periods of time, are they aware of it? Do we need to have all our ICT service providers aware of it? Perhaps not, because they don't support the critical elements of the business that come in under the regulation. Similarly, the incident reporting, do we know about the 4 hours, 72 hours, the 1 month under DORA, or perhaps the 24 hours, the 72 hours, and the intervening reporting under the NIS2 directive? Do they need to know about it? And then the supplier integration, once again, do we need to have all our suppliers involved in everything, or just certain elements? Is there a particular department in an organization we need to have involved in there? What do we need to do around our recovery operations? Once again, back to our how soon do we need to have our data back? And also, how soon do we need to be, my apologies, that's my phone ringing. So, and how much data can we lose in that period? Our recovery time objective or our recovery point objectives, as they're known. So once we've looked at our systems, once we've done our business impact and analysis, once we've seen where something is a high risk or a critical item, we then apply the principles of proportionality or appropriate, depending on which regulations we come in under. Now, so we've developed our supplier management program. We've done our due diligence. What is an element that would facilitate us carrying on doing this? So quite often when I look at a system goes through 3 phases. There's the initial phase where we come up with how it is that we're doing things. There's the learning phase where now that we've come up with that initial one, we've put it into practice and we've found improvements. And then we reach the end state, which is the minor changes as we go forward, the mature state. So here's an example of elements that should be in your policies to help control, are we doing what we say we should be doing, or what we're required to be doing under the regulations? So we can see here that There's some simple elements on the policy, which is what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? People are informed. What is the scope? So we have it in the areas that are relevant. And then what are the objectives here? So if we look at the objectives, we want to ensure suppliers meet cybersecurity and operation resilience standards. So there we are, two elements of both NIS2 and DORA. We want to make sure that we're protected, and if something happens, we can get back up and running quickly. We want to make sure that we maintain oversight and control over our third-party risks, and we want to comply with our legal and our regulatory obligations. So how are we going to do all those? So what are we required to do? Risk management, risk assessment, etc. So suppliers shall be categorized based on the risk. And in our policy, we call out what are those levels. We say, okay, critical has a direct impact on the core ICT or financial operations. We can obviously expand that in the language around DORA, if we come under DORA, or in the language around NIS2, if it's NIS2. And if we don't come under either, just under our own business. High, access to sensitive data or systems. So perhaps a critical one would bring down our core system, whereas a high one would bring down an important system, but perhaps not something we need to get product out the door or to support our core systems on a daily basis. And then low, minimal operational or data access. So for example, a supplier that manages our door access controller from the example from the previous webinar, it's sitting there on a machine in a cupboard locked away. If there's an issue with that supplier, well, they can't get at the machine unless they walk in the front door, so we'd categorize them as low. Due diligence and onboarding. So we call out in the policy, we must do our due diligence and our onboarding. So before the engagement, we make sure we've conducted a risk assessment on them. If they say they're ISO compliant or similar, we look for evidence of that. We look at for financial stability and legal standing. So we go onto the appropriate websites, maybe something like Dun and Bradstreet. Maybe we have a service we can subscribe to. Perhaps it's as simple as checking on LinkedIn what the history of the company is, maybe the reviews of them. Due diligence can come in many forms. I wouldn't discount any of them, but I would certainly prioritize the professional ones and then looking for the other ones to give more of a color around it. And then when we're done the onboarding, do we have legal contracts, SLAs, or similar that are enforceable? So have we got the appropriate legal advice around that? Contractual requirements. So what must those contracts include? So we must include our data protection for the GDPR and also under elements required under the other regulations. We must have our confidentiality clause. Each and every due diligence I receive mentions, do we have appropriate confidentiality clauses in place? Very important under some of the new regulations, the instant notification times, GDPR, NIS2, DORA, all have their own instant notification times, can result in penalties or sanctions if we don't meet them or exceed them. Need to make sure we have them documented and called out. Our ongoing monitoring, we call it out in the policy. As I discussed earlier on the compliance calendar, we put in how often are we doing it? Is there an annual risk assessment? Is there a quarterly risk assessment? What does that look like for the company? Continuous monitoring of the performance and compliance. We call out in here, what is the expectation that we get from our suppliers? Similarly, the review of the security certification and the audit reports. We call it out here, do we look for it, for example, under DORA at least annually, to do a proper due diligence of all our suppliers. If we don't come in under DORA, what do we feel is appropriate? We make sure we have this called out in the policy. The policy is reviewed every year. We make sure it's fit for purpose and that everyone is notified or educated on the policy such that it is useful and effective in the company. Incident management. Suppliers must report the incidents promptly. Very important. If there's an issue, you notify everybody, and ensure that it doesn't spread any further, that we mitigate the issue within the company themselves, and that we address the problem as quickly as possible to get ourselves back up and running. There's no point. I would say there's a famous one, but maybe it's not famous per se, but there was an electrical power supply issue along the east coast of America and Canada, whereby there was 3 particular systems on a given day. It was very hot. Power lines drooped, grounded out, caused a fault on a system. One part of the control system wasn't functioning in terms of being able to project what the expectation was, so there wasn't enough available load to come in from the power stations. Another part of the system which reported on those errors was currently be working on by the IT team, and they hadn't notified the control room that they were going to be getting garbage back on it. So the control room were looking at not getting correct information from one area, and we're getting wrong information from another area, and they didn't realize that what they were seeing was correct. What happened ultimately? And a great deal of Canada and the east coast of the US lost their power that day when 3 separate main lines went down. Also, there was monitoring equipment that wasn't fully up to date in each of the areas, and the control room weren't aware that some of the monitors weren't providing the same information as other areas. So reporting incidents when they're happening and keeping everyone up to date, really, really important in many areas. The joint incident response plans being in place. So where we rely on a supplier, have we done the test with the supplier involved? Have we sat around a table and done a tabletop exercise? Have we gone in and done a full DR situation? Have we looked at all the learnings from them and implemented them? This is the post-incident review and the corrective actions. So no point in testing and leaving. We must test, learn, and work forward from there. Final element then, sorry, no, not quite final, termination and our exit strategy. So we must make sure that we get our data back. We must make sure we can carry on our business. We must maintain the continuity of the critical services during the transition period around them. And if we need to do an exit audit on the system, let's do that as well. Our roles and responsibilities, we call that out in the policy. Procurement perhaps looks after the initial screening and contact management and ensures elements of that happen. IT security are brought in as a part of that process, and we do the risk assessment and the compliance monitoring. We have the legal representatives, perhaps it's internal, perhaps it's external, look at what we're doing. Has there been any material change since the last time? Are there specific requirements here? Let's get the appropriate documentation in place. And then from the business unit themselves, are the suppliers meeting their performance then afterwards? Are we getting the SLAs that we were told we were going to get? Are we getting our reports when we should? And then finally, in our policy, we ensure that this is a living policy. So we look that the policy is reviewed annually or on any significant change or operational changes. So that was a journey there along the path to getting a suitable supplier management process in place. I think I've duplicated the next slide, so I'll just look there now and check. Yes, I've managed to duplicate that. So I'll go to our final thoughts then based on what we looked at there. So if we haven't started, what do we need to do? We should start with a gap analysis on our current supplier management practices and look to see from those essential items, what are we missing there? When we've looked at that gap analysis, let's build out a roadmap so that we look to see how are we going to get to certain points along this. I go back to what the supervisory authority said on the first day. Look, if you haven't started, do your risk assessment, do your asset management, identify your critical elements, and draw up a plan on how you're going to address that. You're not perfect, but at least we can see that you're working towards the right end. When you've looked at what those are, and you have your risks and you have those, make sure you're using an appropriate framework or tool set to keep you between the ditches, to make sure that you are fulfilling all your obligations, to make sure that you're getting an appropriate response from the system. And then finally, as part of this, all around the supplier management, it's really a case of trying to engage the suppliers within the company to get them to become stakeholders themselves, perhaps to a degree, because it's in their interest that the relationship continues, grows, and is positive. And we want to make sure that when something does go wrong, that we're all there to help each other, and that ultimately we all succeed at the end. We want to look for win-win solutions out of this if we can at all. So I'd like to thank you all for your time. I'm glad to see I've reached the 10 to point, so we have time for a few questions or observations if anyone has it. I do appreciate it's holiday time at the moment. Supplier management is still important though, even in the holiday time, and we need to make sure that we address that going forward and look to adhere to any of the regulations that are out there. So once again, thank you all very much. I'll go over to questions if anyone has them. And Senan, thank you very much for rejoining us there now.
Yeah, no worries. It was an interesting, good few slides there, Jason. Has anyone got any questions?
No, someone is ringing me
Keep
on my
popping
phone
in.
again.
They definitely have questions anyway.
No,
Okay,
I
if
don't
there's
think
no
we do.
questions anyway, if there's no questions, we might wrap it up there, folks, and give you a few minutes back before 12 o'clock. Thanks a million, Jason, for a most informative talk, and we'll see you at the next webinar. See you guys.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Appreciate all your time, and look forward to seeing you all again.
Bye bye.